Hi, I'm Michael P. Coleman, Content Director for Brother Be Well. Thanking you for checking out this Parents and Caregiver series brought to you by Blue Shield of California's Blue Sky Initiative. Hi, I'm Michael P. Coleman, Content Director for Brother Be Well. While 19.1% of youth have an anxiety disorder, almost 32% of teens, one in three, suffer from one. Similarly, about 20% of all teens suffer from depression before they reach adulthood, and only 30% of those depressed teens are being treated for it. It's easy for us to see that both of these statistics are on the rise, in part due to our being, at the time of this production, over 2 years into the coronavirus pandemic. Today, thanks to the support of Blue Shield of California's Blue Sky Initiative, we're discussing two mental health disorders, anxiety and depression, being disproportionately managed by youth in the COVID era in which we're living. And we're going to talk about all of this today with Mirela Giddings. She's an associate marriage and family therapist with HearYou.org. Hey, Mirela, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. I'm happy to be here and educate on a really important topic that
It's
I
good.
don't think gets talked about enough.
It's not talked about enough, so let's take care of that right now. Let's get into the conversation right now if you're ready.
Absolutely. Let's go.
Let's do it. First, briefly define, and we've talked about anxiety and depression a lot on the Brother Be Well platform, but for the sake of this conversation, can you briefly define anxiety and depression?
Yeah. So for depression, you're going to be carrying more low moods, such as feeling sad or hopeless, while anxiety will mainly involve overwhelming feelings such as worry, nervousness, and fear. When working with youth, they'll usually think they have depression if they felt long, interrupted moments of sadness, and they may self-diagnose anxiety if they find themselves nervous when doing or attempting to do various things. But these are just baselines. Anxiety and depression can actually present differently per person and can even coexist at the same time.
We're going to get into some of that a little bit later in the discussion, but it's really fascinating how, in some ways, they can show up similarly, and in other ways, it's pretty obvious that youth are dealing with one or the other.
Absolutely.
There's that correlation that we're starting to talk about a little bit. The former often leads to the latter. Anxiety sometimes leads to depression. Can you mind telling us about the impacts of anxiety and depression in our youth, especially if either or both of those conditions are left untreated?
Yeah, so anxiety and depression can definitely exasperate each other and create this cycle of symptoms. I've definitely seen in equal amounts how each can be a symptom of the other. If depression and anxiety disorders are left untreated during childhood, it can lend itself to an increase in behavior problems, declining school performance, social issues, substance use, risky behaviors, or even withdrawing from previous activities that the child may have enjoyed previously. These crucial activities and experiences lend themselves to core identity development in the younger years. So if it's left untreated and it persists into adulthood, we see an increase of later anxiety disorders, depression, substance dependence, and other ways of causing dysfunction, with some of these becoming their core coping mechanisms to adulthood and due to their prolonged use. And so it ultimately makes it harder, but not impossible treat.
You mentioned, Mirela, and I apologize. You often, when we're talking to clinicians, you use the term, and I love the term, cycle of symptoms. Does that just mean a group of symptoms that are kind of coexisting at the same time? Is that what you meant by that?
So by cycle of symptoms, I meant that they're kind of feeding each other. So,
Mm.
right, your anxiety is getting worse and it's causing you depression because now you don't want to go out because you have like these overwhelming emotions. But that same anxiety is feeding into the depression because now say you're missing out on social interaction. So that's what I meant by cycle of symptoms.
I get it. I understand. I really appreciate you helping me with that. The very existence of COVID in all of our lives and the resulting, if you can remember early on, the shelter in place orders, all of the isolation and all of that, it can and has caused anxiety and depression in all of us, independent of age. We're talking about youth today, but we all felt a little bit of that, if not a lot of that. As an associate marriage and family therapist, can you walk us through the mental health pitfalls that our youth, especially, may be facing due to this pandemic?
Yeah, one of the main pitfalls that I've seen in youth is that they're socially stunted, often saying in some iteration that they are feeling nervous in social situations now that we've come back from that quarantine. And a lot of this has to do with the sudden withdrawal from their community that has led to them not knowing or not putting into practice how to socialize or even make friends. So they're having to relearn again how to socialize, emote, and understand cues. And some of these students have developed anxiety around how they create new connections. They over-evaluate their interactions. Whereas other students, the anxiety is presenting itself as kind of word vomiting or oversharing information. They're so overwhelmed in their need to connect with others that they find themselves becoming isolated and find that other students aren't responding to that. The students have fallen into lower moods and greater vocalizations of apathy. So, for many youth, quarantine has forced them to be stuck at home regardless of their family, even if it was toxic or healthy. And so, not being able to even use school as that moment of reprieve from their family, they found themselves relying heavily on coping skills that they had before, which has led to them kind of overusing them, and so they don't get the same benefits that they had previously. So now many of them have lost joy and interest from these activities due to their overuse, and they just feel stuck.
Wow. And it's so interesting to me, Mirel. I think we need to really, we're all committed to caring for our youth and taking care of them. Everything you've described, I felt on some level. So, I with
Mhm.
decades of coping mechanisms and maybe a skill set or two that a young person hasn't developed yet, if we're all feeling that, it makes total sense that our youth would be, for lack of a better word, struggling. They're having a harder time. The conversation, the information you just gave us about getting used to things that they used to enjoy, but they're not getting that same level of enjoyment out of it. That just really touched home. We've got to be really careful, I think, of our youth and help take care of them during this time.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Let's talk about specifically anxiety. And you touched on some of this a little bit earlier, but what are some of the very specific signs of anxiety in youth? And then the second part of this question, is it true that some of those signs, we talked about it earlier, they're similar or identical? How do you sort them out then? What are the best ways to determine one from the other?
Yeah, so, I think a lot of times people think anxiety is exactly how it's represented in the media, but that is not always the case. Definitely, you want to be paying more attention to body cues and language, and especially for youth, if they are voicing that they are nervous, pay attention to that. If you as an adult are noticing that they are afraid to speak up, or you notice that they are not feeling hungry, costed headaches, that could be one side of anxiety. Another one could be maybe their anxiety is presenting as impulsive behaviors. So, really pay attention to body cues and language. Some important language, just again to keep in mind, is maybe they say, "My heart is beating really fast," "I feel nauseous." Maybe you notice they are restless or start sweating. And so, if they're showing some type of sign that they need to get out of a situation immediately, that is like the surefire way to notice that they are having anxiety. And in terms of, how are they similar? It's true that they are similar in terms of excessive worrying thoughts, isolating oneself, and diminished interest in things you once loved. But we want to look at the motivators to see if one is a symptom of the other.
I think there was so much information there that was helpful. One of the most powerful things you said is when they tell you they're anxious, let's listen to them.
Yes.
That's great advice about any one of a number of topics. We really need to do a better job, I think, of listening to our youth. Sometimes it's hard for them to tell us what's going on. I've learned that, and so when they tell you, "I'm feeling a little nervous," please don't brush it off. Oh, it'll pass. It's okay. You got to really pay attention and dig in there and get the information, and then get our youth the help that they need.
Yes, absolutely. And that is, and I'll talk about this again, but really just voicing to the student that you are listening to them and you're not belittling them makes a huge difference.
Thanks for that, Muriel. I really appreciate it. Let's get into this next question. What are some of the specific signs of anxiety in our youth?
So, some of the specific signs of anxiety in the youth are going to be things like when they're voicing nervousness, when they are maybe you notice that they start sweating, they're getting restless. They're basically trying to remove themselves from the situation. And so the best way that we want to address that, or even try to treat that with these youths, is we want to figure out kind of what their routine is and see if there's something in their routine that we can either improve or make changes in to help contribute to healing their anxiety. Maybe we find out they're not sleeping enough, they're not eating enough, their day to day interactions are limited. And so looking at their routine, and then also as somebody who's not a clinician, whether you're a parent or a teacher, is really helping them set up a space to decompress. If things are becoming overwhelming, say at home, let's make sure there's a designated area where they can take a break because that can be like a huge game changer for the youth. And for some of my students, their version of decompressing is just being able to burrito in bed without being, accused or questioned, just really just letting them calm down and come to a grounded place. Just you want to create something safe during times of high anxiety.